All right, so we're delving into some details with the whole fanaticism and interesting prospects behind Sony Japan Studios. But before we go into that information, I am announcing, like, during the breaking news that I missed because I was obviously out of commission for a few days, but Sony recently announced that Jim Ryan is leaving the company. Lion Ryan himself is leaving after a 30-year tenure at PlayStation Studios. This came to the news of celebration from the gamers because obviously PlayStation had its fair share of issues we could talk about, namely the lack of communication and the fact that they were having this entire pool of live service games. And it seemed like from the article and Jason Schreier and what he was talking about, that there were developers within Sony PlayStation that were doing single player games that were disappointed at the fact that they were working on an immediate live service title. So there was that, and then we move into the fact that PlayStation rose the prices up. Everything's high, everything's up like gas, and they decided to say, you know, we're going to have this lackluster premium service where you don't get all the old games that you want, and the selection is pretty subpar. Now, of course, despite PlayStation having these issues, Jim Ryan did pioneer the company moving forward. Obviously, these consoles were a success when he was there. The PlayStation 5 is a success, no matter if you love it or hate it. And then there's the fact that he added more credence to Sony Europe, and they got more credibility that way. The man's sort of tenacity and cutthroat business nature cannot be denied. This is why these exclusives did so well. It's why they sold so well under that brand. Of course, there is positives and negatives to everything under the sun, but this is definitely a distinctive case where you can see it as opposed to others. With this information, there was the idea of what PlayStation will do in the future, and I'm going to rip the band-aid off and say there's not going to be a revival of Sony Japan. There's always this sort of fanaticism about they should bring back their top tier studio, Sony Japan. Sony Japan was awesome, it never failed, and that's not quite true. What is true is that it was said that Sony Japan had lackluster sales going forward with PlayStation at the time. You could say their games were creative. They were indeed creative to a large extent, and I love things like Shadow of the Colossus, but we have to be realistic with ourselves and say that Sony Japan sold games terribly. The sales numbers really weren't adding up. They weren't that great. They weren't that stellar. They were remembered for being fun and look back titles like Ape Escape and everything else, but were they really games that sold up to par with what Sony wants now? And definitely not when you compare the two. Like Spider-Man absolutely sold astronomical copies, and there is not a Sony Japan game up to that caliber. This is a business first, so you have to think about what assets are doing well and what assets are just sort of reviewed well and not selling well. And that's probably why the band-aid was ripped off in the past when they announced the closure of Sony Japan, and they decided to rework this as Team Asobi Studios, the team that made Astro's Playroom. And I'm not saying that game is bad or anything, but they sort of reworked that as the brand moniker for Team Asobi. We have this statement here from Wikipedia, obviously, but this is the one that people should cite attention to when asking about the future of Sony Japan. And you know, they are no more. Japan Studio is no more. Alan Becker, who led Japan Studio starting in 2011, said that their complacency, the complacency of Sony Japan during the PS2 era and Japan Studio PS2 era, PS3 era, caused the studio to fall behind on updated tools and methodologies for game development, meaning that they were behind the curve on what people were doing at the time with the technology. and the growing mythology of what we're going to do with these games going forward and how they're going to cater to a distinctive audience and sell well. They were already behind the curve on certain methods in regards to that. And then across late 2020 and early 2021, this is the big news where several notable Japan Studios employees announced that they were departing from the company. According to multiple sources speaking with Video Games Chronicle, Sony had not renewed most of the contracts for that studio outside of those on the Team Asobi side because the studio was not considered profitable enough to continue with original game development. Games cost money, they weren't raking in the money, therefore they got shuttered. It's just a simple thing, an unfortunate thing that happens to studios, and it's not the first PlayStation studio that closed down because they weren't making enough and they weren't versatile enough. Now, while Japan Studio was versatile in creativity, they weren't versatile on making their stuff back, and they closed Gorilla Cambridge. There's been various studios that PlayStation closed because they weren't doing very well in terms of catching a trajectory of the gamers throwing money out of their wallets to them. I believe Sony Ben is actually next if they don't do super well with their next project, because it seems like they've been on the chopping block for a while now. That's just how it goes. Business is business, and you gotta be making something. Then we go to this tweet here, and it's one I readily agree with, and it's like, I love Sony Japan Studio. They made great games. We look at their game category and we see Ape Escape, The Legend of Dragoon, Ico, we see Shadow of the Colossus, Siren. I like Siren. That was a nice little survival horror game that they made. I wish they would make another one, but hey, we're not realistically probably getting that. They made Gravity Rush. Gravity Rush was all right. I like Knack. It was Last Guardian. That game was in development for like 8,000 years before it actually came out, so maybe the R&D for that wasn't really too spectacular waiting that long, and it didn't have the same blow up as Shadow of the Colossus or even Ico for that matter. And then we have this tweet, like I know I said it before and I'll say it again, but I love Sony Japan Studio, but what I do not understand is where the fuck were these bleeding hearts when they were releasing games before? Most of their games flopped financially, hence the business decision to disband or close them completely. So if there are many of us, how did they flop? And people will cite this as Sony wasn't promoting them enough, or their games weren't getting enough thunder. I'll never forgive Jim Ryan for closing Sony Japan Studio. So where the fuck were any of you when the studio was releasing games? How did those best games you claim to be flop financially? I'm also mad at people who claim to love them but did not buy any of their titles. There's probably a lot of people that just go rah because they hate the current state of PlayStation, but honestly, truth be told, no matter what you say about the cinematic third-person venture, those games are sustainable. Like I said earlier, games like God of War, sustainable. Games like Last of Us, sustainable in this market, and they're having that success and marketing and anything. And I think even if those games were highly marketed on a large scale, there are going to be those situations where the reality is, no matter how much is poured into indies or Japan support, some of these games are still going to be relatively niche. They're going to relatively go under the radar just because some of these games just don't appeal to that casual demographic. That's the main demographic that you want to appeal to. And most likely, you know, you have your stuff that really catches thunder, like Souls games, where it appeals to casuals and hardcore, and it could come out, like, you could just have a title come out like Lies of P, and people really enjoy stuff like that. Some of those games would not catch thunder. I guarantee you that with all the marketing in the world and all the creativity in the world, there are some people that just wouldn't go out and buy a Gravity Rush. We had stuff like Bayonetta that took a while to get the sales that it got, like 1 million sales. You're going to have to realize that some of these Japanese games that you consider that should take the mainstream place just are not popular enough to do so in certain instances. There are times where that paradigm is broken. Yes, I would agree. You have stuff that's popular on the Japanese market, like Devil May Cry, and even Devil May Cry doesn't have the same comparable sales to something like a God of War, but then you have your super popular things like Resident Evil, Metal Gear, that are well up there, and then there's mid-tier recognition, then there's like low tier for some of your favorite franchises out there. I think Sony Japan was a victim of cause and effect with the way the industry was moving and what Sony wanted. And I think moving forward, you may see the president sort of diverge and cut things like prices. It depends on how consumer friendly that guy is. From what people get wrong, they say the interim president that's going to take over is going to be the main one, and he's just there for a while. He's going to be the middleman until they find someone else, that's for sure. It depends on who they pick next, although I don't think their drastic money flow is going to be changed. You might see more third-party support from PlayStation. You might see them evolve their criteria. And they've been doing this. They might take the indies to the next level and promote them more like they have been doing, but you have people that grown during state of plays that have indies and sort of titles like that anyway, and say, where's the mainstream big budgeted AAA games? This is bullshit. They should show what's going on from Naughty Dog and Sucker Punch and all these other studios. And it's always funny that the support is just never there for those niche smaller titles, and it's like very, very small, and it's like people have to accept this is what is happening. While it is reasonable to have more communication between PlayStation Studios and what they're doing, I'd say that Sony Japan was a victim of cause and effect. It wasn't sustainable enough with, once again, waiting 8 years for Last Guardian, and all that research just goes into the waistband in terms of its popularity and reflecting back on people actually buying it. You need to have these games bought to have some sort of like stepping stone. It goes for any studio over there not really pulling their weight. You have to pull your weight on popularity, good games, and of course sales. What is hot, what is in the market, what is flowing around in social media, and getting that promotion and getting that sort of stature. And once again, while they had good games, it ultimately did not save them from their fates of being shuttered forever. And if you were someone, you know, all this word of mouth that people say on social media, oh, the third person stuff sucks, why don't you use that energy to promote those super innovative games and say they're innovative, as opposed to just saying I don't like it because AAA is taking over? Look, AAA games in PlayStation, AAA first party deals, exclusives, they're always going to be there, because guess what sells PlayStations? Yeah, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure all that out immediately. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what sells PlayStation now and why the PS5 has been sort of more or less gravitated to for those single player games. Those are what sells the platform. And again, while Japan Studio had its time in the sun, they already knew they were a step behind in terms of where they were going so far. This is Renegade Operative signing off. Japan Studio is probably not coming back. I expect the team Asobi Studio to continue with Astro's Playroom and maybe tinker and toy around with ideas. Nothing really too super spectacular. I don't think that the Spider-Mans of the world, I don't think that the Ghost of Tsushimas of the world are going to be overridden. But you could say that PlayStation could use more exclusives, more IPs, and it's true, it's never nothing wrong with having like new IPs on the table, but maybe that's what they are cooking up. Maybe they are cooking up those innovations, and I find those games to be good. I have no problems with how they're doing their cinematic third-person games. naturally you'll have idiots saying they're all the same, which is a mega fucking lie, because God of War couldn't be more dissimilar as a hack and slash RPG type game from fucking Uncharted, where you're going around taking cover and using third-person shooting mechanics to win in that game. And it's just something that's always been funny and always been on my mind. But let me know what you think in the comment section below. I think I had a swell time making this video, and once again, I know the truth hurts, but sometimes it is what it is. For the future of PlayStation, it remains to be seen, but I guess we'll see what happens when everything occurs and we have a new president. But I don't see too much drastically changing, maybe bits and bobs, but that's the realistic side effect of the whole ordeal. I'll see you guys next time. Later.